First of all, thank you to all of you for being with us here today. We appreciate the time that you're taking from your schedules. For all of you, the fiscal year 2025 defense bill includes a provision from my office, Section 1074, a report on operational plans of the Department of Defense, which requires an assessment of the operational plans of the DoD in the event of multiple concurrent contingencies or protected conflicts. This requirement reflects the reality that in the event the U.S. engages in hostilities with China, other adversaries such as Russia and Iran will press their own advantage in Europe, the Middle East, and elsewhere. Basically talking about if we have a conflict, we're going to have a conflict on more than one area or one theater at a time. What are some of the considerations that we must take into account when talking about a multi-theater mobilization? And what are some of the key shortfalls that you believe the department should identify and highlight in their assessment? Dr. Berto, would you like to begin?
Thank you, Senator. Let me again go back a few years. So, at the time of the Cold War, we really only had one set of scenarios that we cared about, and that was the Soviet threat in Europe. Everything else was considered to be what we called a lesser included case. That means whatever force structure and capability we'd have to counter the Soviet threat would probably be sufficient to counter any other threat. After the end of the Cold War, we changed that to several different iterations from a planning process point of view, including a two-war scenario, that essentially being the Middle East and Iran, Iraq, and the Korean Peninsula. It turns out after 9/11, we discovered that lesser included cases might be lesser, but they weren't included. And so we had to have a big shift in terms of both our strategy and our force posture to deal with that. In 2012, I was chartered by DoD to do the first assessment of what the force posture would be needed for the pivot to Asia. And what I discovered is there was no basis for that. And so it didn't fit. Again, this was a greater not included rather than a lesser included. And so I think if you look at that evolution over time, the request of your provision is a very valuable and timely request. But it's important to note that that's only where we are today. So, from the operational plan point of view, it really focuses from a combatant commander's point of view of, if I have to fight today, if I have to fight tomorrow, what do I have, what do I do, how do I use it, how do I sustain it and support it, et cetera. I think it needs to be much broader than that of what is it in day 50? One of the lessons from Ukraine and almost every war we've entered in, it may look like it's going to be short at the beginning, it keeps on going. And so where are you at day 700? I think that's another element that is useful to add on there, sir.
Thank you. Dr. McGinn?
Thank you, Senator. Yes, thank you very much for that provision. I think that's important to really focus on the operational plannings. But one of the things that is missing in most operational planning is the role of industry. And so one of the things that we saw with supporting Ukraine is the challenge of production. That we've got to really kind of be able to ramp that up, and that requires really close government-industry collaboration. And we had that during the Cold War. We had these voluntary agreements that created integrating committees that were focused on the production of 155 munitions that were actually not non-FACA boards that allowed for close collaboration between government and industry on production issues. And so we need to have, that needs to be part of the planning. We need to do the war games that have that, because you've seen the war games where if we have a Taiwan Strait scenario, we're out of Schlitz in 2 weeks on munitions, right? So we've got tremendous kind of industrial implications to these operational scenarios that have to be part of the planning going forward.
Thank you. Dr. McKenzie.
Real quickly, I'll just add that the National Defense Strategy drives how the Defense Department looks at operational planning. So the current National Defense Strategy says focus on China. Previous national defense strategies did include multiple conflicts at the same time and looking at that from an operational planning perspective. So, national defense strategy would be helpful here if we are going to really truly look at that. I do want to mention some of the impacts, though, are the types of munitions that we're going to use. In Ukraine, we're fighting mostly a ground war, so we're using a lot of artillery, mortars, things that we are absolutely not going to be using in a China fight. So in a China fight, we're focusing more on surface launch, air launched, long-range missiles. If we now have to add in another fight, say Korea, that we're back to partial ground war. So it really matters which fights we're looking at as to which parts of the industrial base we're trying to ramp up.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator Rounds. Senator King, you are recognized.
Madam Chair, congratulations on your